So my mom told me I could have Ruth or Esther back when she asked me if I would do Sunday school. And to be honest with you, in my experience, like I've had a lot of Ruth in my life, I feel like, but not a whole lot of Esther. And I've been in a lot of Bible studies about Ruth, or like have a lot of series, preached about Ruth, but not Esther. So I was like, Esther. But then I didn't realize that it was like a 10-chapter book, but it was really good. It was good to read through it, and I'm honestly super excited to talk about it today. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, even though I am younger than many of you. I appreciate your humbleness in that way. So first, I'd like to start with, I call it a think, pair, share. Okay, because I do teach. So this is something that I do with my students. Grace, you can be with Sandy and Trinity and Christy, because you're going to need people to talk to at your table. So does everyone else have? Yeah. Okay. So think, pair, share. I'm going to read something for you, and I'm not going to say anything about what I think about it, but I would like for you guys to talk at your tables about what you think. Okay? So, this is something that I found on the internet. It says, the purpose of the book of Esther can be understood as commending human responsibility instead of misguided dependence on God. The Jews in the book must take matters into their own hands to preserve their existence rather than wait for God to act. I'll read it one more time. The purpose of the book of Esther can be understood as commending human responsibility instead of misguided dependence on God. The Jews in the book must take matters in their own hands to preserve their existence rather than wait for God to act. Okay, so if you know a little bit about Esther and how she saves the Jewish people, I want you guys to talk at your table about what you think about that quote. I'm not saying anything till after you talk about it, so. Talk. I'll give you like 60 seconds.
Go, Sarah, go. I think we're all in agreement. As Mama Bear said, where'd you get that? Where'd you get that?
Huh? You're talking about what you think. Yeah. Yes. I'm going to read it one more time. The purpose of the book of Esther can be understood as commending human responsibility instead of misguided dependence on God. The Jews in the book must take matters into their own hands to preserve their existence, rather than wait for God to act. You guys all talk about it? I'll give you just like a few more seconds to share your thoughts. Okay, so we'll come back together. And is there a group with a spokesperson who would like to share? Carrie. She has a thumbs down. Thumbs down. That's it, she says. Anyone else want to share why you agree or disagree?
I disagree because, first of all, God is involved in everything we do. If God hadn't put the thought into Haman's mind, or not Haman, Mordecai's mind, to have Ruth pray for their people, it may not have been done by them, and they could have had lost the blessing from that, because I am of the belief that God has several people out there to do whatever, and there have been times where some people have said no to God. I remember a speaker at one time saying that after she was done doing it and the blessing that she got from God from it, that she was thankful God had chose her first, and God said to her in her spirit, no, you were about the fifth person I asked to do it, and you were the first one to say yes.
Yeah, and she's touching on some points that we're going to talk about today. So, did anyone else want to share anything about that? Well, here's the thing. Esther is the book of the Bible that never actually mentions God by name. So, it's very interesting. But here's my pushback on thinking that because God's name is not mentioned, that it's emphasizing human responsibility and taking things into your own hands. I push back on that and I say, actually, God is acknowledged all throughout the book of Esther. He's not mentioned specifically by name, but he is seen in the ins and outs of every aspect of the story. So the other thing that you might know Esther as is the woman who took a stand for right and trusted God with the rest. Here's a common theme, this I also found on the internet. And there's not, I'll share it with you and then I'll explain. The purpose of I already said that. Be in Esther, bold and courageous enough to stand for the truth, to voice your opinion and fight for the good of others, even when it means to sacrifice yourself. If God has put you in a position, it is for a purpose. Never be afraid to heed to that inner voice. I put, there's a couple of those points that I kind of have an issue with, what inner voice, what are you talking about? But maybe there's nothing wrong really with some of those things. It's a good thing to fight for the good of others. Those are good things, but I think there's so much more to it. And I think that so often when we think of Esther as just the woman who took a stand for right, I think we're actually really missing the big point of the story. And so hopefully I can help with what I learned, and hopefully that helps you guys as well. So first, let me give a summary, because maybe you're not super familiar with the story. So I wrote my own summary. So King Ahasuerus, the ruler of Persia, is wealthy, prideful, and selfish. There's your intro. At a feast that he holds in his own honor, he summons his queen Vashti to come show off her beauty, whatever that means. She refuses, and the king's pride is hurt. He's furious. He seeks the counsel from his wise men, and then decides that the queen must leave his presence, never to return. The king decides to search for a new queen to take her place. He immorally tries out different women until he finds the one that he likes the best, which in this case ends up being a Jewish woman named Esther. She was an orphan raised by her older cousin Mordecai. Because Esther wins the king's favor, she becomes his wife, and there are feasts held in her honor. A plot arises that a couple of eunuchs are planning to kill the king. But Mordecai finds out, and he passes the message along to Esther, who ends up saving the king's life as a tag team. While we could talk about the faith and faithfulness that this demonstrates on Mordecai's part, we are here to study Esther, not Mordecai. Around this time, King Ahasuerus promotes Haman, who is, by the way, a descendant of the Amalekites, which are ancient enemies of God's people. So he promotes Haman to be the head of his officials. They basically become besties, and the king does whatever Haman wants. If you think the king was a narcissist, wait until you meet Haman. Everyone had to bow down and pay homage to Haman, but of course Haman notices and is very offended when Mordecai refuses. Haman is so personally offended that he plans a massive genocide of all the Jews. He runs it by the king and offers to give the king 10,000 talents of silver. By the way, 10,000 talents of silver is close to 375 tons, and it probably made up 75% of the king's annual revenue. So he was going to gain that in spoils from the Jewish people. So, in my words, the king doesn't even look up from his coffee and newspaper while he says, sure, do whatever you want, and hands Haman his royal seal. So Haman issues this evil laugh as he writes letters to all the provinces that contain instructions for the Jews to be annihilated and shown no mercy. Children, women, all of them. The Jews go into mourning and are devastated at this news. Mordecai reaches out to Esther and asks her to act on the behalf of their people. At first, she says no, but with some persuasion by Mordecai, Esther agrees to potentially sacrifice her life in order to try saving her people. She asks the Jewish people to fast and pray for her for 3 days, and after 3 days pass, Esther enters the king's presence, knowing that he would kill her if he didn't accept her appearance in his royal court. She first asks if she can prepare a banquet, and I call it the butter me up banquet because really there's nothing else that they do at this banquet except I think she's just trying to get Haman and the king to like her even more. After that, Haman continues to see Mordecai at the king's gate and is reminded of his hatred for him. So he gets so upset, he prepares gallows, and he plans to ask the king in the morning if he can hang Mordecai. Okay, so this is after the first feast, but Esther has not asked about the Jews yet. So this is probably my favorite part in the story. In the meantime, the king just happens to not be able to sleep at night, and he wants to have someone read to him in the book of Chronicles, and it is recorded that Mordecai saved his life in that book. And so he then just randomly thinks, I never did anything to reward Mordecai for that. So in the morning, when Haman comes to ask if Mordecai can be hanged that morning, the king first asks Haman, what could I do to honor someone? And Haman, thinking that he's talking about himself, of course, gives this very long thing about what the king can do to show honor to someone. But then, the irony, it ends up being Mordecai, so much to Haman's dismay. Later on, Esther throws the second banquet for Haman and the king, and this time she brings her request to them that her people be saved. This is the first time that the king is even finding out that she's a Jew, and it's the first time that he's finding out that the people that Haman wanted to annihilate were the Jews. He actually didn't know that before. So King Ahasuerus is furious with Haman and has him and his sons hanged at the request of Esther. He grants Esther's request, although he could not reverse the letter that had already been sent out. I thought this was interesting. I actually didn't know this. So he tells Esther and Mordecai that they can send a letter out now that tells the Jews to do whatever they can to defend themselves. The Jews end up killing over 75,000 people who were sworn enemies to the Jews. In addition, the king happily promotes Mordecai to Haman's old place as ruler over the officials. The Jews have victory, and they celebrate with a new holiday called Purim, and it is celebrated on the day that Haman had planned to annihilate the Jews. So, it's just a really cool story, isn't it? It's like, whoa, that's such a cool story. So, we're going to talk about this in a moment because this is probably the most famous verse from Esther. But let's get to that. How do we get there? So there are a few things that we learn about Esther from this story. I think I put 4 things. Yeah. So first of all, Esther chooses hope over bitterness. Esther chooses humility over pride. Esther chooses prayer over self-sufficiency, and Esther chooses faith over fear. So first, Esther chooses hope over bitterness. Let's not forget about the difficult circumstances that make up the setting and the background of this story and of Esther's life. She was an orphan. Her parents had died, and Mordecai decided to raise her as his own daughter. But guys, let's not just kind of brush over that, right? That can really do something to someone. Talk about a really difficult upbringing, a really difficult background. And then not only that, but then when the king issues the decree that all the virgins have to come and basically participate in this very immoral beauty contest, and are really essentially raped in the process, they become the king's property at the least. You know, if they end up being like Esther and meet his expectations, become his queen, great. But if not, they become his concubines. And so they literally were just like, no more of the life that they had. Their life is over. It's over completely. Now they are the object of the king, and that's it. So if you think about what kind of things she'd be feeling like that, like no parents. She had Mordecai. Now she doesn't have Mordecai. Now she's at the king's just command, whatever he wants. And if you think about what happened with Queen Vashti, there's probably a lot of fear. These women coming in and they're like, oh, great. And the king's really like, he's harping down on his, like, you can't come into my presence now. So it's a really difficult circumstance. So she very easily could have become bitter. She could have very easily decided, why is God doing this to me? Like, angry at God for really taking her life away, and at least from what she could tell at that time. You can't see all the pieces at that time. So obviously, if you read the story of Esther, it's clear that she's kind. She earns favor with everyone. It's not even just the king. So I think it's not in the right place, but Esther 2:15 says, when the turn came for Esther to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So it's not even just that she's beautiful. Like, you can have a beautiful person, but like no one likes them, But if she's earning favor, that means that it's also her heart. She has a beautiful heart. And you can see that throughout the story because the way that she talks to the king, she's very humble. She's very respectful. The same thing with the way she talks to Mordecai. So she obviously is a very kind person. She's trusting as well. She's willing to go through this. They probably didn't really have much of a choice, but she's going through this process instead of being rebellious and resentful despite her circumstances. I also think about her relationship with Mordecai. She could have pushed back on Mordecai. He's not her real dad or, whatever. But she always obeys what he says. And he told her, don't tell them of your Jewish heritage. And she didn't. She didn't speak of her Jewish heritage. So she's obviously got a very kind nature and manner about her, rather than letting her circumstances take that away. So the other thing is Esther chooses humility over pride. Her first response when Mordecai comes to her with this plan, we'll skip that part. When he tells her that he wants to tell the king, she obeys him. She tells the king about what Mordecai found out and saves the king's life. But then when Mordecai tells her that he wants her to go to the king and ask for help for her people to be saved, her first response was fear. So I think it's helpful to know that because she is still a person and maybe we can relate to her in that way. It's like, oh, I don't know about that plan, So actually, does someone want to look in Esther? It's chapter 4, and could someone read verses 10 through 11? Because this is Esther's response to Mordecai when he comes up with the idea. So just raise your hand once you're there. Christy?
And she instructs them to say, Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal providence know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this was the king to extend the gold scepter to them and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king.
So obviously she's like, no, that's not how things work, Mordecai. And then he pushes back. And what he says is where your famous quote comes from. And so could someone read, we'll just kind of skip through that part. But verse 14, he basically says, if you kept silent at this time, this is my favorite verse. If you kept silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai pushes her and advises her, and we'll come back to that verse later, but with that famous line, such a time as this. So she changes her mind, and she decides to do it. So she's going to put the people above herself. That's one aspect of her humility. She decides, you know what, he's right. I'm going to put the people above myself, and I'm going to sacrifice myself to God's plan. Mordecai demonstrates a lot of faith in that verse, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But she also realizes, no, you're right. Like, God is going to deliver his people one way or another, and I'm going to try to be a part of it because I'm in this position. And so another aspect, she sought Mordecai's counsel. She listens to him despite her authority. She's the queen, She can be like, stop telling me what to do. But she listens to him. And you can also see her humility later on in the way that she addresses the king. When she says, if it please the king, she always says, if it please the king. She calls him my lord. So she demonstrates this respect for him and is never demanding, which probably wouldn't go over very well if she was. And then the third thing that I want to mention is Esther chooses prayer over self-sufficiency. It's interesting, God is not mentioned specifically, but prayer and fasting is. And Esther, her response, she says, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. And I think it's really cool that she recognizes where her help is going to come from. She realizes, okay, before I do this, I need to get help from God. And you guys need to help pray that I can have that help. I think she needed supernatural guidance and direction, right? She needed to know how to go about this. And she ends up doing it through those 2 feasts. So she kind of uses like a little bit of a strategy, and she needs some time to prepare for those 2. She also needs supernatural strength to move forward with this plan. And that was going to come through the prayer of his people. She also needed God's intervention. What happens on the second night? The king can't sleep, and that's when he reads the story about Mordecai and is reminded, oh yeah, I need to bless Mordecai. And all that happened because she waited, right? So there's a lot of significance to the fact that she allowed for the process of God to work. And she wanted to know that she had his blessing, and she wanted to make sure that she was doing it his way and in his timing, not in her own way. So the final point of what we learn about Esther, she chooses faith over fear. And that's a common phrase, but I'm like, hey, it really applies in this situation. So there's actually a song out there called Born for This by Mendiza, and it's in this what's the name? It's like these CDs that go through different characters of the Bible and has a song for each person. But anyway, the words of the chorus go, sometimes you have to go uninvited. Sometimes you have to speak when you don't have the floor. Sometimes you have to move when everyone else says you should stay. You have to ask if you want an answer. You have to stand apart from the crowd. Long before your heart could run the risk, you were born for this. So I'm like, okay, it's got some truth to it. I mean, she did have to get up that courage and that bravery to go outside of her comfort zone and to go into the king's presence, knowing very well that he could choose to, off with your head. So she enters his presence with requests 2 different times. The first one is the banquet, but then the second one is to ask for him to save her people. And I'll read that part really quick. That's at the second banquet. She spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet. Oh no, that's after. That's after Haman's hanged. Hold on, I want to read the one before Haman's hanged. On the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Half. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. which, by the way, she quotes exactly those words from Haman's letter. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther says, a foe, an enemy, the wicked Haman. And he's sitting right there. He's sitting right next to the king. So then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the story goes on. Then the king decides to hang Haman. So she enters his presence with 2 requests. So she did have to do this multiple times. It wasn't just one time that she went before the king. She also is the reason for Purim. Let's not forget about how, it's because of Esther that we have this really cool story of the Jews killing over 75,000 people on the day that they were supposed to be destroyed, right? That's such a cool story, and that's why they celebrate with their holiday. And she is the ordinary person that God chose to use to bring about deliverance. Esther, yes, she became the queen because she was beautiful. And if you think back to, at the beginning of the story, it says that she was beautiful and she had a really lovely figure. God planned it that way, right? Because that is what King Ahasuerus wanted. He planned for Esther to be made that way. He's the one who gave her that beauty. That was nothing because of her own doing. That was God's plan. And he just used someone who was ordinary, who lost their parents at a young age, was raised by their cousin, but to become the queen and to save the people. And it's not just that. This is all part of God's huge plan of protecting his people. The Abrahamic covenant, it goes back to that, So there's this song that I really like. I tend to quote songs. It's by Josh Wright, and it's called What You Could Do With Me. And I want to read you these words because this is a trend throughout Scripture. This is a pattern. And so, I'll just read these words. You took a stone to kill a giant. You took a staff to part the sea. And only you could do so much with ordinary things. You took a slave to tame a lion. You took a rock to make a spring. And only you would choose a shepherd boy to be a king. So I don't have to be the strongest, because you are perfect in my weakness. If I can move a mountain with faith like a grain of mustard seed, I wonder what you could do with me. You're the God of all creation. You're the king above all kings, but only you would choose a rugged cross to rescue me. You're the healer of the broken. By faith I still believe. You took on my flesh. You conquered death. Lord, you are my victory. So I don't have to be the strongest, because you are perfect in my weakness. If I can move a mountain with faith like a grain of mustard seed, I wonder what you could do with me. So what we see in the story of Esther is that God chooses to use another ordinary person to accomplish amazing things. And she was willing to be used by God, right? So what do we learn about God in the book of Esther? And this was my favorite part, since he's not mentioned. And by the way, I have this study Bible by John MacArthur, and he has this hits the nail on the head. He says, Esther could be compared to a chess game. God and Satan are the invisible players, and they're moving real kings, queens, and nobles. When Satan puts Haman into place, it was as if he announced check. And then God positioned Esther and Mordecai in order to put Satan into a checkmate. So I think that's such a good way of putting it. It's there is so much going on behind the surface here. It is not just about the people in the story. God is the one who's making things happen. And so what we see is, first of all, God keeps his promises. Mordecai demonstrates this faith. So going back to my favorite verse, 4:14, he says, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. So Mordecai's it's not about you, Esther. God's going to save his people. Do you want to be used by him or not? That's essentially what Mordecai is saying. And I think about that in our own lives. It's wow, God wants to use us. And the question is are we willing or are we not? So God is going to keep his promise. He's going to deliver his people. There's no question about that. So Mordecai demonstrates that faith while he reminds Esther of her special position where she can help. Then also, the Jews destroy their enemies even under a pagan king. So God uses all the whole situation, even a pagan king's leadership, to help for the Jews to destroy their enemies. Psalm 121, verse 4 says, "Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." Don't you see that in this story? God's not asleep. He didn't doze off. He's very much active. So God is keeping his promises. He also enjoys using us in his plans, even though he doesn't have to. And this kind of goes back to that song. Consider Moses, right? He was the one with the stutter. He did not consider himself as someone who had people skills. And God comes and finds him and says, you're going to go before Pharaoh and use your words to deliver the people. He's like, what? David, he was a shepherd boy. He didn't know he was going to be king. That was totally unexpected curveball, but it was all part of God's plan. Esther, another one. How about Jesus? He's another one. Now that I have a baby, the concept of Jesus coming as a baby is so much weirder to me. Just consider how humble God had to be to put himself into the position of a newborn baby. And then to live the life that he did. He wasn't this warrior that the Pharisees were expecting, right? He was meek. He was gentle. So consider how God uses us in his plans, and he always does the unexpected. He likes to keep us on our toes. God is sovereign over all. That's a big one for this story. God, first of all, sovereignly reigns over King Ahasuerus' heart. Esther 2:17, it starts with, he loves Esther, right? The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. God was in charge of that. That was God's plan, right? And he used a pagan king. And then Esther 5, verse 2 says, and when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, this is when she comes before him. When he saw her standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. All right then, right? She didn't even ask anything at that point. He's like, yeah, I'm okay with this. And the same thing happens in verse 6 when he grants her request and he says, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. God was in charge of that. That was God's sovereign plan. And then chapter 6, verse 1, on the night that the king couldn't sleep. That's how it starts. It says, on that night that the king could not sleep, he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before him. And it was found written how Mordecai had saved his life, and so on. God was in charge of that. God is the one who was poking him, not allowing him to sleep that night, right? Like, God is all throughout this story, and his plan cannot be thwarted. It cannot be thwarted, no matter what we do. If Esther had said no, like Mordecai said, someone else would have done it. But chapter 9, verse 1, it says, now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict was about to be carried out, on that very day, when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. Isn't that a cool way of putting it, too? And it says, the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. So on the very day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred, and the Jews gained mastery over their enemies. That's how God works. That's all part of his sovereign plan. Another point is God intercedes for us. He reminds the king of Mordecai's heroism the night before Haman plans Mordecai's death. I think this is kind of the pinnacle of the story, right? God was in the king's head, and he was making things happen at just the right time. To not only save Mordecai's life, but this is my last point, God has a sense of humor. Mordecai is honored instead of Haman, right? I mean, we have to look at that part of the story. So Esther 6 through 11, Does someone want to read it? Esther 6, 6 through 11. Okay, Mom.
So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on his head. And then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai, who sits within the king's gate. But leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken."
So isn't that so funny? Like, God has a sense of humor. He used Haman's pride to be his downfall. And Haman hated Mordecai with a burning passion. And who ends up taking Haman's place? Mordecai. Mordecai gets paraded around the town in the way that Haman wanted to be paraded around the town. And then after Haman dies, Mordecai takes his place as the ruler in the palace over the officials. So it's really cool how God, and actually the end of the book says, chapter 10, verse 3, the very last verse of Esther, it says, "For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus." Wow. How did that happen? "He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people." So God ends up also positioning Mordecai in a place of serious importance. So the final application, I have 3 things. Trust in the one who overcomes the world. Even when circumstances seem less than ideal, God is at work. Even when we don't see the evidence, God is at work. Even when everything seems to be falling apart, God is at work, bringing everything together. I have an example. Last night I was on the phone with my grandpa who lives in New Hampshire, and he's just had a lot of really rough things happen, and I could probably tell you about some of those things, but just the current living situation is he's blind and he can't see, and he takes care of my grandma who has severe Alzheimer's, to the point where she doesn't know how to dress herself or go to the bathroom or doesn't know anyone or anything. She doesn't remember that he's her husband, but she does know that he loves her, So he's in this very difficult situation that often feels lonely, and recently he fell and broke his collarbone. It just felt like one thing after another. And I asked him last night, I was like, "Well, how are you?" And he was like, and he doesn't talk about this very often, but he was like, "Well, I'm not really that great." And he said, "But God is so good." And then he just says the whole gospel. And he took 3 minutes. And I was crying by the end of it. And he's like, "Are you there?" I'm like, "Yes." I was like, I just needed to hear that. And he just continued to talk about how good God was and how God had was taking care of him, no matter what, even in those difficult moments. And so I think of that testimony and I think, trust God who overcomes the world. He is working when it doesn't seem like it. Also, take opportunities to be used by God. Set aside the fear and the uncertainty that hold you back. Believe that He has sovereignly placed you where you are for such a time as this. Speak up for the truth, no matter the repercussions, and push yourself outside of your comfort zone. Make a difference in your circle of influence. You might not be a queen, but you still have people that you influence, and you still have people that you come in contact with. Another song is One Awkward Moment by Casting Crowns, one of my favorites. Now, Esther was in a much more serious situation than one awkward moment, right? This was like a life or death situation. We, however, are typically facing more of those awkward moments kind of situation. Ooh, I don't know if I want to tell my waitress that I'm about to pray for her. Ooh, I don't know if I want to tell this person who seems to be struggling that God can help them and that I want to help them. Oh, I don't know if I want to bring that up. I feel uncomfortable. I feel awkward. I'm shy. I'm an introvert. You know, we'll always come up with reasons. We'll always have excuses. So what are we going to do about those? Are we going to miss out on opportunities that God can use us? It's not that like that person's going to go to hell because you didn't talk to them. No, no, no. God will use someone else to do it. But don't you want to be used? That's what I'm asking myself. I'm not trying to target you guys. But like, don't I want to be used? Like, can I bear that awkward moment because it could potentially be like an opportunity for me to see God save someone's life, right? Or for me to experience the joy of seeing someone, their countenance change, right? Those are the things that are going to make us feel fulfilled and to bring joy and purpose to what we do on an everyday basis. And the last part is pray first. Our response, this is a quote from a man who has been a leader in my life and an example in my life, Dr. Steve Pettit. He says, our response to life should be to cry out to God in prayer. I can tell you right now, that's not my first response. When life happens, I'm either combative or I'm like, go crawl in a hole and cry. And, you know, like, I'm usually thinking, oh, I need to tell this person or I need to do this. And I am that, like, I fall into that category of that false quote at the beginning of trying to take things into my own hands sometimes. But our response, that means first reaction, what we do, should be to go to prayer. And Dr. Pettit, who gave that quote, when he was going through a really difficult time where his wife was diagnosed with cancer, he talked about how he would repeatedly run to the Psalms. And so I'd like to read for you a psalm by David. It's Psalm, and guys, wasn't that psalm this morning an encouragement? You can apply that to this too, Psalm 56. But Psalm 55, verse 17, this was David's heart. He said, evening and morning and noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. Evening, morning, noon, he is crying out to God. Somewhere else in Psalm, I think it's Psalm 63, he talks about how he remembers God in his night watches, and he meditates on him, even when he's laying in his bed. At all times, our response should be to go to God because he cares. Luke 6:12, and this is what I'll close with. Who else does this example? Who else responds by going to God? Jesus does. And Luke 6:12 gives us that outline. If I can get there. Give 1 second. I can't do this. If maybe one of you could get there sooner than me. I have this clump that won't come apart. Okay, got there. Okay, so Luke 6:12. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. Jesus is another example of that. Esther is an example of that. 3 days, no eating, no drinking, pray. And so that should be our response as well, is to go to God in prayer, because he is the one who will help us. He's the one who uses us, and he's the one who is sovereign over everything that's happening. And wouldn't it be cool for us to be part of this chess game as well? So that's all I have for you guys. Should we close in prayer? Okay. All right. Lord, I thank you for the story of Esther. I just pray that you would allow the truths that we've learned to permeate our hearts and to affect us as we go about our different days and schedules, and that we would be looking for opportunities to be used by you, that we would be blooming where we're planted, you know, the sphere of influence that we have, Lord, that we would be seeking ways to influence it for you and for your glory and for your kingdom and your purpose. And I also pray that you would just help us in times of trouble, that the first thing that we do is to go to you for help and to seek your desire and to trust in your timing. When things seem like they're falling apart, Lord, we know that the pieces are actually coming together in ways that we may not ever really see or know until we're in your presence. And so we thank you for that. We thank you for the hope that we have in your plan and that your plan cannot be thwarted. In your name, amen.